welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson, and today we're continuing with the Chopin Etudes. I'm planning to analyze most of these marvelous pieces for you over the next period of time, and today is the so-called Winter Wind Etude, Opus 25, number 11. The subtitle Winter Wind was not Chopin's title, just by the way. Chopin almost never gave his pieces descriptive titles, but I suppose that this one is apt enough, although it's more of a blizzard perhaps than a wind, and there's something definitely martial and warlike about a lot of the motives. We take these etudes so much for granted nowadays. They're an integral part of auditions for pianists going to music school. There are countless complete recordings of all these etudes. That was a feat that was almost unthinkable at one time, but now people play all the etudes, even in concerts, all the time. We take them so much for granted that I think we oftentimes forget how groundbreaking they were back in the 1830s and also how inspired they continue to be as musical creations. There's something kind of eternal and timeless about the musical image of these pieces and about the economy of means that Chopin uses to create his effects that just keeps me, anyway, coming back for more. I never really get tired of hearing these pieces and playing them. So these so-called studies are really miniature tone poems rather than technical exercises. Unfortunately, you do hear some rather clattery, technically minded performances of these pieces from time to time, and it's hard to really blame anyone from playing that way, since many of them are extremely difficult, and that is a major part of your effort in learning the piece. You don't realize until you start practicing the harder Chopin etudes how difficult they really are. The only other pieces in the repertoire that really come close are things like the big Liszt etudes, the Transcendental etudes, for example, and his most difficult fantasies, maybe the Don Juan fantasy, or something like that. You could also think of certain works by Alkan and some of Godowsky's pieces and studies. But even those last-named pieces are less demanding in a way. In a big Liszt study, for example, or even in the Godowsky Chopin studies, there's a little bit more to hide behind. There's a little bit more going on, more counterpoint. The most difficult Chopin etudes, of which Winter Wind is one of them, but I would also add the first two from Opus 10 and the Thirds Etude from Opus 25, are so exposed. There's nowhere to hide. There's something, in fact, quite classical about how precise the technical demands are. And when you add to that the enormous stamina that's required to play through a piece like this, especially on a heavier modern instrument, you have really quite a tour de force and quite a journey to overcome the difficulties. So, diving right in to analyze a bit of what's going on in the piece, the main theme, of course, is famously stated in a basic form at the beginning, like this. So, besides the obvious repeated note, there's a very prominent minor second. The melody rises to an F and falls back to E. In the main part of the etude, this basic theme is moved to the left hand, while the right hand introduces the etude figuration, like this. Looking closer at this new figuration, we see that it's really a composite figure, which means that we can divide it into two separate melodic lines. So we can hear on top a chromatic scale, and on the bottom an arpeggiated chord. It's really as simple as that, but it creates an astoundingly complex sounding texture, just jumping back and forth between these two lines. And it's also remarkably difficult to play at tempo. Just by the way, this kind of figuration is really only a step from the figurations in Bach's solo violin and cello suites. There oftentimes are figurations like this where composite lines are created by jumping back and forth between different registers. From the technical standpoint, this is another variant on the idea of Opus 10 number 2. Another one of the hardest of the Chopin etudes. In that etude, Chopin has the pianist playing a chromatic scale with 3, 4, 5 in their right hand, while the thumb and second finger play chords. In the case of the Winter Wind, the accompanying notes are offset a little, so you don't have to play them at the same time as the upper voice, which makes it very slightly easier to play than Opus 10 number 2, but only slightly. Let's listen on a little bit more, because as the main theme in the left hand continues, the counterpoint figuration in the right hand changes form a little bit. So the entire piece is based on these two figurations, the first chromatic scale one and this second one, which is more of a swirling arpeggio kind of texture. Within this arpeggio texture, though, you can hear clearly falling seconds on the top of the figure. So where do these falling seconds come from? The falling seconds of the main melody. That minor second F to E drop is being composed out in this figuration, and that also brings us to the realization of why the first figuration is based on a descending chromatic scale. It's simply this idea of a falling minor second expanded across several octaves. And once you realize this, you see that this descending second idea, which has kind of a fateful feeling to it, proliferates throughout the piece and is integral to every section. Besides its appearance in the main melody, it's very clearly outlined in the bass and several other places as well. It's simply everywhere. You'll also notice that in some passages, especially where the mood becomes more triumphant in the major mode, that Chopin reverses this motive and places rising seconds in the left hand. From the harmonic standpoint, the piece functions exactly as you'd expect. There's a polarization between A minor and the related major key of C major. It's pretty straightforward, actually. This dichotomy, of course, is set up in the introduction. We have the melody first by itself and then harmonized in this very distant, kind of eerily hymn-like way in C major. The harmonic simplicity is partly what gives this piece its sense of epic grandeur as well. For the most part, the harmonies move very, very slowly. Even though there's a lot of activity and figuration, the harmonies are just holding, sometimes over 4 bars at a time. In the so-called development section, I call it a development section, there's a wonderfully shocking passage where the underlying harmony for several bars is a diminished 7th chord, being outlined by the left hand. It creates an incredible feeling of anticipation and excitement. And as we approach the end of the development and start moving towards the return, the harmonies start to move faster and faster. So from half bars to every quarter note. Also another wonderful moment, a kind of macabre humor right before the return of the main theme, where Chopin kind of cuts his figuration into pieces with these jerky rests. So this is one of my favorite parts. I think this has to be played in a kind of humorous way, not too strictly in time. It's worth pointing out as well that the unforgettable slow intro, which I've referenced a couple times, was an afterthought on Chopin's part. Originally, the piece began right at bar 5, but apparently, right before he was going to send this to the publisher, the intro came to Chopin when he was sleeping, and when he woke up in the morning, he just wrote it down and set it off, and that was it. It's so lucky that he thought of it, because it's the perfect beginning for a well-nigh perfect piece. And now, a few thoughts on practicing this piece and tackling the technical difficulties. For my own part, I had never performed this piece before. This was my first time really bringing it up to performance level, although I had practiced it in many years ago. So it was a little bit of a journey getting it to the point where I could play it. It was much harder actually than I was expecting. I thought I'd be able to get it into my fingers a little faster. So this time coming back, I used a variety of approaches to get the figuration into my fingers. One exercise from Cortot that I found to be very useful as a preparatory exercise is this one. You're just blocking out the figuration in the right hand, and you should play it staccatissimo. And there are two variants as well that I quite like, these two. I started out playing the entire piece with the metronome after that. I started at quarter note 60 to around 90 or so. Then once I felt pretty comfortable playing through without stopping at this kind of moderately slow speed, I switched to using some rhythmic practice. And opinions abound about how to use rhythms when practicing difficult passages. Some people like to use dotted rhythms, kind of like this. Another popular method are bursts like this. I've used those at various times in the past, but nowadays the most useful figuration for me is just to alternate one beat at half speed and another beat at full tempo. And you can do this actually taking eighth notes as your beat or quarter notes, really. And of course, you want to do the opposite as well, starting at tempo and then on the second beat having half speed. In addition to this, I played the piece through as many times in a row as I could, once I was comfortable playing at tempo, to develop stamina and the focus that's really required to see you through. So as soon as I finished the last note, I would begin again at the beginning and play through as many times as possible, maybe 8-10 times. At first, I omitted the first 4 bars, the slow intro, but then I realized that created a problem because you actually need to condition yourself to feel secure moving from the very still pianissimo opening right into the torrential fortissimo figuration. It's actually very hard to do if you don't practice that many times. And if you feel unstable at the beginning of the allegro, there's no way you're going to feel good for the rest of the piece. So that was actually the hardest link for me. It took a little while actually to get the opening to be secure in the context of actually playing the piece. I'm sure if I was playing this piece every day for a longer period, like if I was actually playing it in concerts, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But since I'm always kind of rushing these things to record for this channel, it's a little bit of a different situation, and I had to really work hard to condition myself well there. One little caveat as well, in this recording, I have a little mess up in the left hand towards the end of the piece. I'm sure you will hear it easily if you know the piece or if you're following the score carefully. And I went back and forth about whether I should try to re-record this or not. See, the thing was that I'd already done maybe 8 or 10 takes, and I got this one that I was very happy with, except for that one mistake at the end. It's a silly mistake. It's not even hard to play. I just transposed a couple of notes. But in the end, I thought that the take was successful enough that I would just leave the error in as kind of a token to the spirit of live performance. Things just happen in live performance, and it's okay to have a little small blemish like that. A couple other musical details as well, just matters of the text. You'll sometimes hear this passage at the end played with a B in the left hand, and apparently this is in the French first edition. I haven't actually seen it, but it's referenced in the notes to the Paderewski edition, which uses this version. They state that the manuscript and the German first editions do not have the B there, and I much prefer the A, actually. I can see why the B would make sense because it's the outline of the melody, but this is actually supposed to be a reduction to the basic harmonic outline of the theme. That's part of what gives it this kind of brutal savagery, is the actual simplicity of what's going on in the bass. So I'm inclined to think that the B is a mistake or some kind of interpolation by the printer or something. I don't really think that that's correct. Also, you might notice my tempo is a little bit on the slower side. I think this piece is very effective, very slightly slower than the tempo that Chopin marks. I think there's a certain kind of majesty and grandeur that you lose if you're playing it too fast. And that's actually the case for several of the other etudes as well. I talked about that in regards to Opus 10 number 1. I also mentioned, I think in a previous video, how frequently composers tend to write metronome markings slightly faster than what they actually play. And I think that that's oftentimes just because we tend to hear music at a faster speed in our heads. And when we're actually dealing with an instrument and an acoustical space, oftentimes there's more physical resistance going on that just slows the tempos down slightly, very naturally. So although this piece is very possible to play at 69 for the half note, I still prefer something around 56 to 60 myself. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed the complete performance of the Winter Wind. Please also consider supporting this channel either through www.patreon.com/independent pianist, where you can make recurring pledges to support this channel over the long term, or you can also make one-time donations. I have links for PayPal, Revolut, Venmo, and various other payment methods in the description box. Also, you can consider studying with me if you're interested in really taking your piano playing to the next level. Drop me a line at cole@independentpianist.com if you want to schedule a free consultation. Also, next weekend I'm going to be playing a live concert, Sunday, March 26th, at 4 p.m. at Laremont Manor in Bellingham, Washington. So if you happen to be in that area and you want to hear me play live, I am going to be playing a concert there, and you can get tickets at the door. So with that in mind, next week I'll probably be doing something which is not performance related, since I'm practicing all that stuff right now. But I'll still be here next week, so please do stay tuned for that. And until next time, take care.